The grid at midnight. At 11:47 at night, Isaiah Grant stood in a dim control room at the edge of Detroit with a printout in one hand and his phone recording in the other. On the paper was a log, a long column of timestamps marching down the page, the automatic heartbeat of a substation reporting itself to the grid second by second all night long. And in the middle of that steady heartbeat was a hole. 3 seconds. That was the whole of it. 3 seconds where the alarm sequence simply stopped, then picked up again as if nothing had happened. A gap no operator would ever notice in a stream of data no human was ever meant to read line by line. The room around him had gone still for the wrong reason. Not the hush of a quiet shift, but the stillness of people who had just decided all at once to stop talking and watch what the outside expert would do. Across the room, Harold Pike smiled. Pike was the chief operating officer of a utility conglomerate, a man who spoke in the calm, reassuring tones of someone who had never personally sat in the dark when the power failed. He smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the ending has already been written, approved, and filed with the regulators. In his hand, Pike held a preliminary incident summary. He was about to release the one that would call the previous night's outage an unfortunate equipment failure and close the matter before the morning news. Isaiah looked at the 3-second gap. He looked at the wall clock. He looked at Pike. "Don't touch that," Isaiah said. "The clock is lying." Nobody in the room expected the sentence. And in less than a day, on the hottest evening of the year, with air conditioners screaming across the city and the grid stretched to its limit, a single manipulated control command could cascade across 3 counties and put millions of people into the dark at the exact moment the heat could kill them. The only person in the whole system willing to believe him had not walked in yet. Her name was Simone Baptiste. She was a public utility commissioner, and before this was over, she would matter to Isaiah more than any grid ever could. This is the story of 3 missing seconds and what it cost the man who refused to look away from the hole in the record. Part 1. The detail nobody wanted. Isaiah Grant was a black single father and a power systems cybersecurity architect, and he had learned the first rule of his work long before anyone gave him a title that long. The rule was simple, and it was the same in his world as in any world where the truth could be erased by a careless hand. Panic destroys evidence faster than fire, faster than water, faster than any lawyer who ever billed by the hour. When a grid stumbles, the instinct of everyone in the control room is to act, reboot the system, clear the logs, restore normal operation, and file the paperwork before the phones start ringing. And every one of those instincts overwrites a little more of the truth because a modern power system keeps its secrets in data, and data is the easiest thing in the world to quietly change. A log rewritten is a crime forgotten. A system restored is a system that can no longer testify to what was done to it. So Isaiah did not touch anything. He never did. It was the thing that made impatient people call him slow, and it was the thing that made him impossible to discredit later. The detail had begun as almost nothing, a 3-second gap in a substation's alarm sequence at the precise moment the outage began. Everyone else read the failure as a breaker that tripped on its own old equipment giving out on a hot night. But a breaker that trips on its own screams the whole way down. It floods the log with alarms. This breaker had gone quiet for exactly 3 seconds first, as if someone had reached in and told it to hold its breath while a command it was never meant to receive slipped through in the dark. Isaiah did not call it proof. Professionals earned the right to use that word slowly. He called it a question. He captured the log from 3 separate sources, cross-referenced, time-stamped, before anyone could touch the live system. He noted the exact moment. Then he did the thing that separated him from the clever people who trusted their own conclusions too fast. He asked a colleague, a control room operator named Bev, who had no stake in the outcome and no reason to lie for him or against him, to sit and witness the whole capture, and he wrote down her name. A witness to the collection is worth more than the collection itself. To the people waiting to close out the incident, this looked like caution bordering on obstruction. A utility crisis has a clock. It has regulators and reporters and customers demanding to know when the lights come back. Every minute Isaiah spent preserving a log was a minute the whole company held its breath. But Isaiah had spent his career in SCADA forensics, in incident containment, in the maze of regulatory procedure, and above all, in the rarest skill of his trade, turning technical evidence into plain truth that an ordinary person could understand and a court could use. And what all of that told him staring at those 3 missing seconds was that the pattern was too sharp to ignore. The gap was not random. It sat exactly where a human intruder would need the system blind in order to send a forged command without setting off every alarm at once. The silence had been engineered. Somebody had made the substation look away at the precise instant it should have been screaming. He preserved the original logs. He built a verified working copy hashed so no one could claim he'd altered it. And on a fresh page he wrote down every hand and every account that had touched the system since the outage. That last step is the one nobody applauds. It is also the one that holds. He checked the assumption twice. Then he asked the only question that ever mattered. Who benefits if I'm wrong? The first person to oppose him was not Harold Pike. Pike was too smart to be first. The first was a shift supervisor named Doyle, a tired, decent man who did not want to be a villain and did not want to be a hero, who wanted only for this one incident to stay ordinary so he could file the report and go home to sleep. Equipment glitches, Isaiah, Doyle said. Old gear drops a few packets. The log skips, it happens. You're going to cry sabotage over 3 seconds nobody would ever miss. Isaiah understood the temptation better than Doyle knew. He had a daughter asleep at home. He had a mortgage and a contract that could be canceled with a phone call from the same executives now watching him from across the room. And he had a reputation built over years of careful work that could be destroyed by a single rumor that Grant saw hackers in every hiccup. If it's a glitch, Isaiah said, it'll show up randomly across the whole history. Let me pull 6 months of logs. If gaps like this happen all the time, I'll sign your report myself and never say another word. He pulled the logs. Gaps like this did not happen all the time. In 6 months of data, the 3-second silence appeared exactly twice. Once last night, and once 3 weeks earlier at the start of a smaller outage that had also been written off as equipment failure. Twice in the same shape at the start of 2 convenient disasters. That is not a glitch, that is a signature. And Doyle went quiet because somewhere under his tiredness he had wondered too. He just hadn't wanted to be the man who said it out loud. Isaiah rebuilt the sequence minute by minute. He left blanks where a lesser investigator would have invented a bridge because a false bridge is exactly how the guilty escape. They wait for you to guess, then prove your guess wrong, and once one claim fails, everyone forgets the 10 that held. He documented the whole exchange before emotion could revise it. Credibility, he knew, is built in the details nobody claps for. Simone Baptiste arrived without a dramatic entrance. That was the first thing Isaiah noticed about her, and it was not a small thing. Officials, in his experience, arrived with an entourage and a schedule. She simply came into the control room alone, listened for a full minute before she said a word, and then asked him the 2 questions that set her apart from everyone else in the building. What do you know? She said. And what do you only suspect? Give me both. Keep them apart. Most people wanted Isaiah to be certain because certainty is comforting and it makes for a clean press release. Simone wanted him accurate, which is harder and rarer, and she made him answer both questions out loud until the line between fact and instinct was clean enough to carry into a hearing. She was a public utility commissioner with style, patience, and an independent streak that had made her inconvenient to powerful men for most of her career. She could not be rushed, could not be flattered, and had a way of asking the simplest possible question at the worst possible moment for whoever was lying. She was beautiful in the way confidence becomes beautiful over time. Direct eyes, a measured voice, an intelligence that refused to be flattered into carelessness. Her restraint pulled at Isaiah before either of them would admit it. But that was later. That night, she was simply the first person who understood what 3 missing seconds could mean. If you're right, she said quietly, then last night wasn't a failure. It was a demonstration. Somebody was showing what they can do. I know, Isaiah said. Then we do this carefully, she said, or we don't do it at all. Because careless is how the people who did it get to do it again. By morning, Harold Pike had an explanation. It was a good one. Neat enough to comfort a board of directors, smooth enough to satisfy a reporter, clean enough that anyone who had not looked closely would nod and move on. Aging infrastructure, an unfortunate but ordinary failure. Nothing that a big new emergency maintenance contract couldn't fix. The explanation accounted for everything except timing, and timing in a power system, as in every system, was where the lie confessed. Pike's story required the breaker to have failed on its own. But a breaker failing on its own does not fall silent for 3 seconds first. It alarms immediately, loudly, all the way down. The only way to get that engineered silence was to send it a command, and to send a command you needed access, and access left a trail no matter how carefully someone tried to sweep it. Isaiah did not accuse anyone. He simply laid the 2 facts side by side, the way a real failure sounds and the way this one had been silenced, and let the gap between them speak. Pike studied that gap for a long moment. Then his smile changed the way a man's smile changes when he decides to stop being reassuring and start being something colder. You're very sharp, Pike said. Almost too sharp. People that sharp make executives nervous. They start to wonder whether you're finding problems or creating them to stay employed. Be careful how sharp you look, Mr. Grant. I'll take my chances, Isaiah said, and the hottest evening of the year was still a day away. Part 2. The pressure changes shape. Retaliation from powerful people rarely announces itself. It does not kick down your door. It arrives dressed as concern. First came a consultant hired that same week who suggested gently that Isaiah might want to step aside from this particular investigation. Not because he'd done anything wrong. Simply because he was so close to it now and objectivity mattered so much, and wouldn't everyone rest easier if a neutral firm took over? Then came an old friend, an engineer Isaiah had trusted for years, who pulled him aside and lowered his voice. "Companies like this don't threaten you," his friend said. "They just let your contract lapse and blackball you quietly with every other utility in the region, and a year later, you're wondering why nobody will hire a man with your resume. And they'll swear it was budget the whole time." And then 3 nights later, the message arrived. No name attached, just a line of text on Isaiah's personal phone, a number he had never given out. "Stop asking questions or lose the career you built." Isaiah read it twice. Then he did the thing that disappointed everyone betting on his fear. He did not delete it, and he did not answer it. He saved it, screenshotted it, backed it up, and reported it through every proper channel, turning a private threat into a public record. He refused to make it a duel. A duel is what they wanted because a duel has two people in it, and a duel can be lost. A record has no opponent. A record just waits. The decision cost him. It cost him sleep first, and then it cost him work as clients who valued comfort over loyalty found quiet reasons to bring in someone less complicated. It cost him the easy company of colleagues who had once traded shifts and jokes with him. Some nights he came home so tired he sat in his car in the dark garage a while before he could go in and pretend the world was fair. His daughter, whose name was Ada, was 12 and far too observant. The kind of child who read a room the way her father read a log file. She would look up from her homework and study his face. "Bad day. Long one," he'd say. "Not bad. Long." And she would nod as if she believed him. And then some evenings she would quietly push half her plate across the table toward him and say she wasn't very hungry. She had seen him skip meals in the tight months. She knew exactly what the tight months looked like. And every time she did it, Isaiah had to get up and busy himself at the sink so she would not see his face. That was the real cost, not the contracts. Half a plate of dinner from a child who understood too much. One night, through the dark of her doorway, Ada asked him if he was going to lose his job. "I'm not going to lose my job," he said. "You seem worried." "I'm careful," he said. "That's different. Careful is how you keep the lights on, yours and everybody else's." He wasn't certain it was true when he said it. But he had decided, standing in that doorway, that he would rather make it true than make it easy. Some promises you keep by refusing to break them one impossible day at a time. A witness appeared. His story was too convenient to trust, and it arrived too easily, the way a gift arrives when someone wants something in return. He was a young systems technician who claimed he'd watched Isaiah tamper with the logs himself, plant the 3-second gap manufacture, the very evidence he was now pointing to. It was the kind of testimony that, if believed, would end the investigation and Isaiah's career in the same afternoon. The man who'd found the sabotage would become the saboteur. Isaiah did not humiliate him. That was the mistake the young man's handlers were hoping for: an angry expert bullying a nervous kid, a scene that would look terrible in a hearing. Instead, Isaiah tested the account the way he tested everything: against records, against access logs, against the simple human fact that fear makes memory uneven and rehearsed lies come out too smooth. The young man's story was too smooth. It ran in a straight line, start to finish, no hesitations, no corrections, none of the small confusions that live inside real memory. Real memory stumbles. It doubles back. This account had been walked many times before it was ever spoken aloud. Isaiah let him finish. He did not interrupt. Then he asked one quiet question the young man had not been prepared for, about which terminal he'd supposedly watched the tampering from, and pointed out gently that the terminal he named had been logged out and locked at that hour with the badge records to prove no one had signed into it. The straight line broke. The young man opened his mouth and nothing came out. "Somebody scared you," Isaiah said. It was not an accusation. It was almost kind. "I'm not going to add to it. But understand something. The people who wrote that story for you will not be standing next to you when the lights come back on. They never are." Behind the young man's fear was pressure, and behind the pressure was a shape far larger than a single manipulated outage. It pointed toward an engineered rolling outage scheme, deliberate, repeatable failures designed to make the grid look dangerously unreliable, so that the conglomerate could justify enormous no-bid emergency contracts, and so that Pike could dump a failing subsidiary onto public books at a premium price right before it collapsed. Break the grid on purpose, then get paid to pretend to save it. Isaiah did not celebrate. He documented, and he moved carefully closer to the center. And the closer he came, the more human wreckage he saw scattered around it. Operators who had been told to keep quiet. A control engineer who had been blamed for the first outage and quietly pushed out his name ruined so that the truth would have somewhere to hide. "Anger is useful," Simone told him one night. Over 2 cups of coffee neither of them drank. "It shows you where the motive lives. It will never replace proof. Stay angry if you have to. Just don't let it into the record." But the part 3, the offer and the vanishing. Harold Pike finally spoke to Isaiah directly. The tone was civilized, almost generous. They met in Pike's office high above the city where the lights of the grid Isaiah protected spread out below them like a circuit board. Pike talked about the future the way a man talks about a system he owns. There would be a role, a senior position, a title with the word chief in it, a salary that would make Isaiah's old contract look like pocket change. There would be stock in the very restructuring he'd stumbled into. And beyond all of it, there would be peace. No more silent phones, no more dead months. A life free of friction laid out clean as a schematic. Isaiah heard the insult folded inside the generosity. The offer assumed that a man who had survived hard times could be bought with easy ones. It assumed his integrity was just a price nobody had met yet. He declined without a speech. He had learned that a speech gives your opponent something to answer. Silence gives them nothing. Later, alone in his car in the dark garage, Isaiah let himself feel how close the temptation had actually come. Not because he wanted the title, because he had a daughter and the salary Pike named would have meant she never pushed half a plate across a table again. That was the real bribe, not his comfort, hers. He thought about the coming heat wave, the millions of people who would be trusting the grid to keep them cool and safe. He thought about the elderly in walk-up apartments, the hospitals on backup power, the children, the sick, the whole vast web of ordinary lives that hung on the lights staying on. He thought about the control engineer blamed for a failure he never caused. And he thought about the version of himself that would take the money and become quietly one more man who had read the signature and looked away. Ada would only know the good years if he took it. That was a terrible part. She would never learn they had been bought with the city's safety and other men's ruin, but he would know, and a father who lies to himself cannot teach a daughter the truth. So he started the car and drove home, and he did not take the money. Then the evidence disappeared. The verified logs were gone from the secure server. A backup archive that should have been locked was found wiped, and within a day, someone had turned that loss into an accusation, whispering that Isaiah Grant was careless with sensitive data, that he could not be trusted, that perhaps he had deleted the logs himself because they never said what he claimed. The setback worked because it held a grain of truth. Isaiah had trusted a system. He had assumed a secure server was secure, that a chain of custody would be honored, that the rules protected the facts. But the system had never been built to protect inconvenient facts. It had been built to protect the men who ran it. He did not fall apart. He and Simone simply began again, this time from sources no one could reach and erase. The hash he generated the first night stored offline. Copies of the log pulled from a regional interconnection authority that Pike did not control. Badge records. Vendor timestamps. The small stubborn witnesses left behind by ordinary work, the ones people forget to erase because they never think of them as evidence at all. They took our copy, Simone said, so we prove it from everyone else's. A grid is connected to 100 systems that don't answer to Harold Pike. He can't wipe them all. Part 4. What the records say. The legal path mattered more than Isaiah wanted it to. Simone walked him through it line by line. What could be entered and what could not. What needed a subpoena before it meant anything. What order the evidence had to arrive in and which regulators had to be told first because the truth revealed the wrong way could be ruled unusable no matter how true it was. Isaiah hated the delay. Every day they waited was a day closer to the heat wave, a day the grid stayed one forged command away from disaster. But then he understood what the patience was for. If they cut corners, Pike would not lose. The evidence would simply be thrown out and he would walk away cleaner than before, shielded by the very proof that should have condemned him. So their patience became a strategy, and the strategy became a promise they made out loud so neither could pretend later they hadn't agreed. No shortcuts, no manufactured heroics, no innocent person sacrificed for a cleaner ending. It was Isaiah would think later, the moment he stopped working beside Simone Baptiste and started trusting her. Their trust never announced itself either. It grew in small practical gestures. A coffee left untouched until the chain of custody was complete. A hand placed briefly over a shaking wrist after a hearing that went badly. A decision to tell the truth in a room, even when the truth made them both look uncertain, because looking certain and being honest are not the same thing, and she had taught him which one to choose. The immediate danger arrived the way real danger usually does. Not with a warning, with a weather forecast. The hottest evening of the year came down on the city like a lid. Demand climbed past every record. The grid strained every line, hot every substation at its limit, and it was into exactly this moment planned for it that the scheme was built to strike. One more forged command sent under cover of the load, and a single substation failure would cascade, tripping the next and the next, rolling out across 3 counties and dropping millions of people into darkness in the deadliest heat of the summer. Isaiah understood the full design now, and it was worse than fraud. The engineered outages. The inflated emergency contracts, the failing subsidiary sold at a premium to unsuspecting public books, and now the heat wave itself chosen as a stage because an outage that killed people in a record heat would look like an act of God, an overwhelmed grid, nobody's fault, the perfect cover for the crime that caused it. They were not hiding one scheme. They were planning to hide it inside a catastrophe. It was the kind of plan that only made sense to a man who had stopped counting customers as people. It never called itself sabotage. It called itself restructuring. When the moment came, Isaiah did exactly what his years had trained him to do. He did not improvise. He ran it as an incident containment by the book, coordinating with the regional authority and the regulators, logging every action, keeping the chain intact, so nothing he did could later be dismissed as a rogue expert overstepping. He isolated the compromised substation before the forge command could cascade. He rerouted load. He kept the lights on. The operation moved fast but not carelessly. Every decision that night was built to survive review. And in the middle of it, the 3-second gap finally paid off. That first small detail, the one Doyle had called a glitch, the one that had cost Isaiah his sleep and his contracts and nearly his name, that detail unlocked everything. The engineered silence, the forge command, the access trail nobody thought would survive. And the man who had believed, right up until that night, that no one would ever read the logs closely enough to see the whole. Part 5. The truth has a price. The reckoning did not happen in a dark alley, and it did not happen with raised voices. It happened where accountability actually belongs. Before regulators, before counsel, before a public commission, and people required by law to answer precise questions under oath. Harold Pike tried charm first. When charm found nothing to hold, he tried outrage, the wounded fury of an important man insulted by a lesser one. And when outrage failed, he tried one last betrayal, turning on the contractors and insiders who had done the technical work in the hope that giving them up would spare him the deepest fall. Each move failed for the same reason. Isaiah had built a case, not a legend. He had no single devastating flourish, no thunderclap line. He had something far more dangerous to a man like Pike. He had the logs pulled from systems Pike didn't own. The signature gap appearing twice in 2 convenient disasters, the access trail behind the forged commands, and independent witnesses whose accounts had been tested until they held. Above all, because this was his rarest gift, he had made all of it plain so that people with no technical training could see exactly what had been done and exactly who had gained. At one point, Pike looked directly at Isaiah across the room, and for the first time there was no charm in his face at all. Just a cold curiosity, the look of a man studying something he does not understand. "You could have had everything," Pike said, low enough that only Isaiah could hear. "Why throw it away for people who will never even know your name?" And Isaiah, who had asked himself that same question in a dark garage and in a doorway and through many sleepless months, gave him the answer simply. "Because I'd know," he said. "That was always going to be enough." But when the full shape of the scheme finally emerged, the engineered outages, the inflated contracts, the subsidiary dumped at a premium. The heat wave chosen as cover, everyone in that room understood at last why every earlier inconvenience had mattered. Why Isaiah had captured a log from 3 sources. Why he had written down every hand that touched the system. Why he had refused to guess, refused the money, refused to turn a threat into a duel. Harold Pike did not fall because a crowd demanded it. Crowds are fickle, and men like Pike had ridden out worse. He fell because decisions leave records even in a machine as vast as a power grid, especially in a machine that vast and records eventually meet someone patient enough to read them. The consequence was lawful and quiet and complete. An emergency regulatory order freezing the fraudulent contracts and the sale of the subsidiary. A chain of custody preserved so carefully no lawyer could break it. Sworn testimony that opened the whole scheme to the daylight it had been built to avoid. And the grid stayed up through the heat wave. Millions of people ran their fans and their air conditioners and slept through the hottest night of the year, never knowing how close they had come to the dark. Isaiah was offered praise he had not sought. He accepted only the part that belonged to the people who had stood with him when standing with him was dangerous. Bev, who had witnessed a capture at midnight. The control engineer whose name was cleared and whose career was restored. Even the young technician who had chosen in the end to correct his lie rather than live inside it. Part 6. After the noise. In the quiet that came afterward, Isaiah Grant and Simone Baptiste finally met with no case file between them. Neither of them pretended that danger had created what was between them. Danger does not create character. It only reveals it. And over the long months of the fight, each of them had seen exactly who the other was under pressure, which is the only version of a person that ever really matters. So they chose a slower beginning on purpose. Dinner after the last hearing with no evidence to discuss. Messages that did not require an emergency. Room deliberately made for trust to become something durable rather than something forged in a single crisis and cracked by the first calm week. Isaiah was still a single father, still careful with the private parts of his life, still the kind of man who wrote things down and checked his assumptions twice. That did not change, but something else did. For years he had believed survival was the most he could hope for. Get through the night, make the mortgage, pack the lunch, keep his daughter safe, and ask for nothing more. Standing in the ordinary evening with Simone beside him and one of Ada's drawings folded in his jacket, he understood that survival and peace were not the same thing. He had been so good at the first that he had stopped believing he was allowed the second. This time, he allowed himself both. Months later, the public record had settled into its final shape. The fraudulent contracts were cancelled. The rigged sale was unwound. The people who had been blamed for other men's sabotage had their names returned to them, which makes a smaller headline than a scandal and matters a great deal more. Isaiah went back to work with the same discipline that had saved him. Observe, verify, document, act. He did not grow reckless with success because he had watched what recklessness did to Harold Pike, and he had no intention of becoming a quieter version of the man he'd brought down. Simone walked beside him now, not as a prize for surviving a scheme, as a partner who had chosen the truth back when the truth was expensive, which is the only time the choice ever counts. The city kept humming light after light, indifferent and enormous, full of people who would never know how close the whole grid had come to going dark on the deadliest night of the year. And somewhere beneath all that ordinary power in the endless quiet stream of data, no one was ever meant to read the truth, Isaiah Grant had fought to protect remained exactly where he had put it. In the light, and on the record, because in the end, that was the whole of his work and the whole of the man. Not the crisis, not the save. Just a stubborn refusal to let a lie hide in the noise from someone who understood that the smallest act of courage a log preserved, a gap noticed, an offer declined at midnight can save more than the world will ever pause to see. End.